Well, this evening's presentation, as I mentioned, we're going to be discussing the work that both Kittitas and Yakima counties are doing to enhance floodplain function. And one of the things that we wanted to do also is just to take a couple of minutes while I review some housekeeping, is to put into the chat, why are floodplains important? Because we're going to have a little bit of a poll at the end of our presentation this evening. So just throw in there your ideas of why floodplains are important. Some people think floodplains are quite dangerous and others think they're fantastic like we do. We're going to have time for questions and answers after the presentation, but if there's some burning questions that we think that will inform the second presentation that we have this evening, we'll probably take a couple of minutes as we transfer into the second presentation to address those. You can type your questions into the chat box or ask them at the end. We're going to keep you muted during the presentation, but we can unmute everybody at the end as well. But you're also going to need to unmute yourself. And if you're on a phone, apparently we're not going to have too much luck in unmuting you. So if for some reason you're not unmuted, just unmute yourself. You should be able to change the size of the presentation. This is a Zoom platform and there's a little plus sign that can make the presentation larger. We did a run through earlier today and everything seems to be working really well. And also we're going to have 3 more talks in our Winter Speakers series, perhaps another one, but right now we're focused on the 3 coming up. One is stage 0 restoration. The other is bull trout in the Yakima Basin and drones and restoration work. They're happening about every 2 weeks. So please take a look at those and see if there's some interest there. Some of the things that are going to be talked about this evening, I think are going to directly tie into all of these presentations. So we hope that you're going to enjoy us. Join us for these next talks, and we're glad that you're here this evening. And with that, we're ready to get started. So our first presenter this evening is Arden Thomas with Kittitas County. Arden settled in Washington State after several summers spent exploring the Olympic, Cascade, and Sierra Nevada mountain ranges. Since those early days traveling watersheds on foot to conduct avian and plant surveys, she has advanced salmon recovery and habitat restoration projects in Western and Central Washington, and worked at the federal and nonprofit level to improve water resource management given environmental needs. For the last 4 years, she has worked for Kittitas County as the Water Resources Program Manager, a role that integrates responsibilities to secure and protect water resource supplies for our community and address flood risks. And I'll introduce Joel at the beginning of his talk, but Joel is with Yakima County and he's going to give us a perspective. So we're following the watershed. We're starting a little closer to the headwaters in Kittitas and ending the evening in Yakima County. All right, well, Arden, take it away.
Good evening, everybody. First, I just want to thank Mid-Columbia Fisheries for organizing this, all of our attendees for your interest in the topic. And Joel, it's an honor for me to be presenting with you. Kittitas County has a younger program than Yakima County, and Yakima's absolutely been a mentor in a lot of ways, so this is a lot of fun. With that, I'm going to go off video and share my screen so you can see my presentation. So the focus, I'm kind of viewing my presentation as an introduction that really focuses on Kittitas County, kind of introducing and expanding on our theme about many benefits associated with floodplain restoration. First, I just kind of want to orient ourselves a little bit geographically. In front of you, you see the map of the entire Yakima Basin. Our county boundaries are not shown here, but I am going to focus my discussion kind of on a case study situated in the Kittitas alluvial floodplain. First of all, I think that it is just kind of helpful to define a few terms. So floodplains, we simply are talking about areas that flood periodically. Another definition is an area of low-lying ground adjacent to a river, formed mainly of river sediments and subject to flooding. And when we talk about alluvial, we really talk about landforms that are created by the deposition of sediment over a long period of time by more than one river. So in this case, we're specifically looking at how the Yakima River interacts with its alluvial floodplain. I could very easily, and I wanted to, broaden the scope of our talk to talk about a range of floodplain restoration efforts in our county, but I've decided to take a deep dive in this area and really explore some of the opportunities and our efforts in this Kittitas alluvial floodplain. So first, I kind of want to start our story talking about a legacy and a strategy of control along the Yakima River. In front of you is an old map that I've found a couple of copies of, mostly in the area that we refer to as the vault. This is our archive where we keep important papers, and in particular, as I go through and look at our levee records, I find this map. In the center, you'll see a gridded area. That's the city of Ellensburg. And unfortunately, the map's not oriented with north facing up. It's kind of askew. But in here, you can see I-90 cutting through and a number of levees along primarily the Yakima River. There's some further down along Wilson Creek, and really reflecting a number of efforts as reflected in this map, really from the late 40s to the early 70s, to both establish and then maintain levees along the river system. I think that a lot of these levees actually predate the dates on here, but this provides a really kind of good picture of particularly the Army Corps' efforts both to shore up these levees and then do maintenance over the years. Since kind of this time period of really seeing investment in levee production, there's been more and more acknowledgement of some of the downsides of really relying on levee systems for flood control protection. If people are interested in taking a deeper dive, I've taken these images from a video that's been produced by Vox along with ProPublica, and they really explore some of the concrete ways in which creating levees can actually increase flood risk. They build a physical model to explore what that looks like kind of in real life. And they document this in the video that's linked below. But I think a few things I want to hone in on are a few principles that have started to become kind of more and more acknowledged. One is that by confining rivers, as we do when we cut off the floodplain, we have hydraulic impacts, and that absolutely causes the rivers to rise higher and flow faster. Another way of thinking about this is kind of the flip side is thinking about a term that's used more and more recently, ecosystem services, and that that really reflects an acknowledgement of some of the benefits that we see when we allow rivers to spread across the landscape. Additionally, levees displace, the flooding. If you can't access a floodplain, you're either going to need to be conveyed, further downstream faster, or go elsewhere onto another floodplain, or a combination of both. And then also there's a perception of risk associated with levee systems, and often, a level of comfort that sometimes when you have levee systems in place, it really kind of encourages development and encourages development that does not reflect the potential levee. The potential flood risk, even in light of the levee, that the levee may not be built to withstand all flood flows, that they do require maintenance over time, and in absence of this maintenance, can degrade and that those lands can be subject to flooding again. So I touched before on kind of this idea of ecosystem services. And maybe another way of saying this is that not only have people been evaluating the effectiveness of structural floodplain control, but there's also been an increase in our understanding about how rivers interact with their floodplains to create habitat, and that these processes are influenced by a number of different factors. And those can include the size of the floodplain and the associated amount of flow that you have going down. It is influenced by the associated geology. You know, on one level, if you have a river that's going through bedrock versus having a river that interacts with highly erodible soils in contrast, and that we see kind of different patterns in how these rivers look and how they interact with their floodplains depending on these different factors. So there was some research in the early aughts. The ecological side of things was done by professors who were hired by the Bureau of Reclamation to work here in the Yakima Basin to think about the ecological implications of these factors and the resulting streams and stream processes that we found, and also a lot of really wonderful work by professors and students at Central Washington University to help us kind of characterize and think about these different processes and patterns. I think a nice metaphor that I've heard in reference to this work is this idea that we have these areas where we have broad alluvial floodplains that are like pearls on a string. And so what we see and what you see represented in this map is that we have these broad alluvial floodplains that are linked or between areas of gorges or a canyon habitat. And associated with this, we see, you know, as you reach the top of a canyon, areas where we naturally have groundwater upwelling. And then when we have a lot of interaction between the river system, that creates really kind of dynamic and productive habitat. Kind of the county comes into the picture in a very formal way in 2012, and in response to some significant flooding that was really observed during the 2009 to 2011 time period, the Board of County Commissioners established a flood control zone district. And this has been instrumental in terms of kind of providing some resources to enable the county to get engaged in integrated floodplain management, which I'll spend the rest of the conversation talking about. Something that I do want you to keep in mind is this photo. I'm not going to show it in a couple slides, but I'm going to talk about it in a couple slides. So what we're looking at is a road. It's a Ringer Loop Road for those of you familiar with the area, and we're observing some post-flooding damage. So as I mentioned, kind of the formation of the flood control zone district really has enabled the county to enter this era of kind of thinking about integrated watershed management opportunities. And the first project out of the gate that the Flood Control Zone District took on was to do an assessment along the Yakima River and within that Kittitas reach, specifically looking at the reach of the river just south of Ellensburg to the top of the canyon. And this initial effort concluded in 2015, so just a couple of years after formation of the district. Okay, and so this is the area that was within the study area. The map that I'm showing you is actually from that earlier assessment conducted by the Bureau of Reclamation coming on 20 years ago. So something that strikes me, a few things, is that that study really emphasized kind of a legacy of floodplain disconnection that we have, and really spoke to, the development of a lot of infrastructure, including roads, railroads, levees, irrigation infrastructure, which really kind of creates a need to keep the river in place to serve that irrigation diversion, and then also flow modification, which has been a pretty fundamental consequence of the amount of irrigation we have through the Yakima Basin. Something that strikes me about this map is both an opportunity and kind of something that we now have a better understanding of. So this area that was our initial study reach, it was an area of relatively less development and floodplain disconnection. But really, our understanding is that the levees that we do have in place have resulted in more disconnection than what was represented in this map. So here again is kind of a depiction of the study reach for this initial effort, and I have an undated photo that shows flooding within the reach. There are a few reasons why it made sense to start with this area. One, as I referenced, is that there was relatively little development, which creates opportunity. It's also an area where we've seen a lot of modifications in place for flood control. This is an area where we have levees on two sides of the river, and where we've straightened the river for flood control purposes. And it's not clearly articulated here, but there's also been a lot of excavation within the floodplain for gravel mining efforts. And kind of as we've seen, reflected even in that, earlier information that was put out there by Vox, the levees, this analysis did indicate absolutely impact depth and velocity within the study reach. So I have a few maps that show that real quick. And then this assessment, really helped provide information to the county for us to understand really kind of the inherent conflict we had in terms of trying to maintain levee systems on both sides of the river. They were essentially competing against one another. They were our Jeffries levee was making it harder to maintain the Hansen Pits levee, and we were seeing that levee fall apart as a result. That it just fundamentally wasn't sustainable. In this day and age, it's much harder to permit these projects, even maintaining them, due to the associated degradation. So, with this information, we also started having conversations with affected landowners, and they were some pretty upfront conversations, which is that your land is currently being protected by a levee, and that levee will provide less and less protection over time. And we really see an opportunity here to work with you. And that land acquisition has been central to that strategy. And we had landowners kind of take us up on the offer, frankly, to purchase their land so that we could be advancing a strategy that would offer more benefits than kind of pursuing a conventional approach or the historic approach of just maintaining these flood control structures that we had in place. I'm going to point out a few things in this photo. I don't think you can see my cursor, but this is a section of the Yakima River at the lower portion of our study reach. And for those of you familiar with the area, we see Ringer Loop Road right in front of us. And this is an area where we had been seeing the river kind of progressively migrating towards the road and kind of damaging it year after year. Ironically, we were getting FEMA funding to keep putting it in place, but we really saw that that wasn't sustainable. It loops around and meets up with the main road. And in that area that kind of loops around, that's the area where I said to remember the photo. This is an area where it doesn't take large flood events at all. This is flooding that we experienced last June. So just at flood stage, and even those flows, we are washing out the river. And then in the foreground, kind of just in front of the river, something that I want to point out is that we're seeing a lot of deposition and we're having a lot of cottonwood recruitment at that location. Okay, so as I mentioned before, kind of as an outgrowth of these kind of pretty upfront conversations that we've had with landowners, we have been able to purchase over 460 acres to complement public land holdings in this critical reach. So all of the area that is shown in the map that's shaded green, that is currently land that is in public ownership. And the areas that are outlined in green and then has the orange hatching, those are properties that we've been able to pick up since 2019. Okay. One of the reasons we've been successful with this effort is because we have had access to grant funding for these purchases, and the value of these lands and this work to reconnect the river with its floodplain really does advance steelhead recovery plan priorities, and it's going to kind of having these lands in public ownerships provides opportunities for us to remove kind of the levees, and there's a private berm that's in place, and then there's also some irrigation infrastructure that's cutting off side channel habitat. There's broader fisheries benefits. This is a photo of a coho that was taken within the study reach. A lot of our emphasis is on fisheries for a number of reasons. Part of it is, the cultural importance and the Endangered Species Act listings. But in addition, a number of species utilize this habitat. Currently on these properties, we see a ton of wild turkeys. There are great blue heron roost, elk and deer. And that's probably just the tip of the iceberg. And, really at the heart of this effort is to decrease our reliance on levees. We just kind of see the writing on the wall, as I've kind of mentioned, where we are not going to be able to maintain the Hansen Pits levee and the downstream private berm, that is going to put properties at flood risk due to past land use decisions on the part of the county. We also authorized a lot of this land to be subdivided. So we were looking at having 37 new homes within this area that was going to see increased flooding over time. On the flip side of that, by proactively going in, removing levees, kind of thinking about how we're going to manage those flood flows to engage those areas we want to be engaged, where we're able to take something that's a risk and really make it a resource due to the associated environmental benefits. A lot of these floodplain properties were historically used for irrigated agriculture. And as we've gone in, we've purchased property. We've not only purchased the land, but we've purchased the water rights that go along with it. And this has kind of really been important for the county in terms of kind of really securing water resources for our communities. The county has made a commitment to purchase water to mitigate not only for new water uses, which are kind of constantly being added, but also recognizing that all of the individual wells and the historic groundwater use has the potential to have a negative impact on in-stream flows and to more senior water users. So we've been purchasing water for the purpose of kind of making things even out, kind of the idea being that by retiring that agricultural use, we make that water available to support those domestic uses throughout our county. Kind of to that end, associated with the commitment that we've made, which was in response to litigation, we came together late last year to really kind of celebrate that we had really reached an important milestone to securing this water. You know, we had met some commitments that we had made. We met them ahead of schedule, and being able to kind of bundle these acquisitions was really critical for enabling us to be successful. And so now here's a picture of some of the lands we have recently picked up. They currently flood. I'm not quite sure when this was dated, but this is absolutely representative of flooding that we've already seen on site since 2019, and that we know is going to become more and more common. And so now we're really gearing for managing these lands for flood compatible uses. Part of that strategy will be to allow for agricultural uses on a portion of the properties. There'll be the portions of the properties that are set back from the river and not at risk from river migration. And it will be unirrigated agriculture. Something that's important locally. Twin City Foods is a very significant employer in our small community, and they have the need actually to have land to apply their vegetable wash water. And actually their land holdings and ability to do this have been reduced, associated with some floodplain restoration. So it's been part of our strategy to actually make sure that through our management that we're providing the opportunity for them to utilize our lands into the future for that purpose. Mid-Columbia Fisheries, I really need to really emphasize what a wonderful partner they've been. So we've been working collaboratively with them for a number of years. They've been leveraging grants to restore our property within the reach, and also the Bureau of Land Management, utilizing some pretty, traditional planting techniques, as we've also been working to kind of reforest this area. Mid-Columbia Fisheries and their crews has just been absolutely essential for helping us with the stewardship and to make sure that we have successful plantings. And then in addition to that, they are doing some great work to understand what is limiting natural cottonwood recruitment. What processes have we had historically in place, that result in disturbance within the landscape, and then seeds being laid down, and then those trees germinating and growing and being successful. We're not seeing that process functional throughout the Yakima River basin for a number of different reasons. They've been exploring the specific processes up in our neck of the woods and using that to inform restoration strategies on a portion of the property that we've purchased within areas that was historically used for alfalfa and hay production. They are working on an innovative pilot project to seed, irrigate, and then grow cottonwoods in place for the aim of reforestation. And then finally, the land that we are picking up, it really connects really nicely with public land. Bureau of Land Management is our neighbor. The lands that we're picking up will actually improve access to those properties. And there's been a vision for a while to create a trail that would link link in with the Irene Reinhardt Trail that's located further upstream and is very much used and enjoyed by our community, and extend that all the way down to the top of the canyon. And picking up these lands will make that easier to implement that. So just kind of in summary, really with this initiative, again, we've conserved 469 acres of floodplain property that included a number of parcels that would have been developed otherwise, and we've had kind of those associated benefits that I had talked about. Also purchasing water, kind of now having land for open space production that will be used for agriculture and for public access. And with that, I will conclude. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Arden. That was fantastic. And I always learn so much when I hear these. And also, we are so fortunate to have you and Kittitas County as a partner in getting this work moving forward. We're not getting any questions in the chat, so I wanted to remind folks who may have joined us in the last few minutes that if you do have questions, throw them in the chat. We'll deal with them at the end of the evening. If there's anything burning while Joel Freudenthal, who's our next presenter, is getting loaded up, we can perhaps answer any questions. I think we're unmuting you now if you needed to. I'd also like to just give a shout out to the fact that we have a board member of Mid-Columbia Fisheries joining us tonight, Rainer Hummel. We have an amazing board and we just couldn't do the work that we do without them. Plus we have some landowner partners with us, and also Zach Zakavish, who's one of our project managers with Mid-Columbia Fisheries. So thanks everyone for calling in and zooming in, but really appreciate the fact that so many people are interested in this work. Well, I'm not seeing any questions, so hold on to those questions. And remember, at the end, we're going to do a poll. We're going to have a little question Q&A at the end to see what you all got out of this evening. So we're trying to have a little fun thing at the end here. So without further ado, let me introduce Joel. Joel Freudenthal is the Water Resources Strategic Manager for Yakima County. Joel has worked for counties in Washington for 32 years, mostly dealing with general water and watershed management, water infrastructure design, reconfiguration and relocation, and main stem channel modification to improve fish habitat and reduce flood hazard. He spent 11 years in Clallam County working with 6 major river systems, estuaries, and the marine shoreline, and 21 years in Yakima County working primarily for the Yakima County County-wide Flood Control Zone District. Prior to working with counties, Joel worked for the U.S. Forest Service for 7 years in various capacities related to water resources and fisheries aspects of the Mount Baker, Snoqualmie, and Idaho Panhandle National Forest land use management plans. He serves on several committees of the Yakima Basin Integrated Plan and on steering and funding committees of the Floodplains by Design program in Washington State. So with all of that, I hand it over to Joel.
Thank you, Merritt. So yeah, I mean, it's again, thank you for putting this together and having, counties as a non-adversarial partner in floodplain and river channel management and working together to meet mutual objectives. So with that, I think I'm going to attempt to just jump into my presentation. So the title slide here has the many benefits of floodplain restoration, and I really got stuck on the benefits word. And so I'm really going to talk about the benefits and how you can achieve them and how we've been achieving them in Yakima County. And I think that the most critical thing to achieving benefits is to stick to the fundamentals. That's the way to get to the benefits. And my number one fundamental is, even in the course of the largest pot of money spent on floodplain management in this country, spends about we're not really managing this problem. We're not really catching up with flood damage in this country. But for each dollar spent on flood pre-disaster flood mitigation, $4 in damage is saved. So if you want to do the math, you could say it's 4 times more expensive. Or if you want to do the math of both of those fundamentals, you could say pre-disaster mitigation is 20 times as effective as doing things after the fact. So spending money on pre-disaster mitigation is highly efficient economically. Restoration of floodplains generally provides big disaster reduction benefits over the long term. So one of the things is that the federal government actually has recognized this. So they started in 2019, the BRIC program, Building Resilient Infrastructures and Communities. And it is really set up to front load the program of pre-disaster mitigation, both based on the amount of damage we had in the last year, and even more so on direct appropriations from Congress to this program. So a better thing is that in the BRIC program, you have to do benefit cost analysis to qualify for the grant. And a featured portion of that benefit cost analysis is the annual ecosystem restoration or ecosystem services benefits of floodplain. So for each acre of floodplain you restore or create, so this is really about levee pullback, restoring access of floodwaters to places. The benefit cost analysis calculates you get $27,000 a year for each acre that you restore. And that really, creates a big boost to your benefit cost ratios, a significant boost. And they actually originally put that in as kind of a sidelight. And in 2021, they actually amended the BCA and actually said, well, we think we should be accepting floodplain restoration projects, straight floodplain restoration projects, as pre-disaster mitigation projects as well, because of the undoubted benefits of floodplain restoration to reduction of flood hazard and provision of other economic goods in this great nation of ours. So to me, that's a big bright spot. We're moving forward. Fundamental 2 is really, designed for sustainability. So this is a photo of our Natchez River levee at Ramblers Park. And this is a collapse that occurred in 2012. And it's the 11th time that this particular section of levee, which is actually, I don't know, mile and a half, not a mile and a half, 3/4 of a mile long, has collapsed. And it's the 5th time that this actually shorter, lower section has failed or collapsed since 1994. So it's not a very reliable flood protection structure. It is a very expensive flood protection structure to maintain, costs about $300,000 or $400,000 of federal and local money to fix it every time it fails. And when you have these failures, generally they're either in the spring flood or over the winter floods, but either way, they're not the best time to be working in the river. And so you end up doing these repeated emergency exercises and kind of repeatedly working in times of years and in ways that is really damaging to the ecosystem, and kind of resetting it over and over and over again, and never allowing it to heal and move forward and actually progress and go through succession. So the funding paradigm that we're in of spending most of the money on post-disaster mitigation actually leads to this kind of a scenario. And once you build one of these things, it leads to expansion of it and repeated failure. So you start throwing money down a rat hole, and then you really start throwing money down a rat hole. And the construction manual for the levees is not really designed to take into account local conditions very much. It's designed so that when the new Corps person comes out to a levee for the first time, he has a real good idea, he or she have a real good idea how that levee was constructed, okay, and what it would take to bring that levee back to the original specification. And that's how they fight things. So the system is set up to allow for failures and fixes. And it's the only, public policy I know of that allows for and plans for failure to occur outside of normal times, outside of what the normal environmental legal process is for the regulation of these projects. And so it's just a really, really, really odd and unsustainable way of doing things. And this is, very different than, how you design for sustainability. So there's a couple of different ways of looking at rivers that are, I think, excellent ways to design for sustainability. This first one here was published in 1954, by the Bureau of Reclamation, and it's probably the most cited article in both hydraulic engineering and fluvial geomorphology, and it's the importance of how rivers move around to designing of hydraulic structures. And even though we've known this for a while, it hasn't really been adopted as a standard design element or a standard design philosophy by FEMA or the Corps or Reclamation, even though if you believe, like me, that the hallmark of science is predictive power, this approach allows you a much greater predictive power to figure out how the river is going to respond and what the eventual outcome of your new hydraulic structure or your restoration action or whatever you're doing is going to turn out to do. Lane spent a lot of time in his career actually building these physical models out there in space, because we didn't have computers and math and all those kinds of things, and changing slopes, putting in structures like a dam here in a model, and then running water and sediment down these artificial physical models to see how these systems would respond. And so, most people, and still most engineers today, would think that if you build a dam in a river, sediment will build up behind that dam, and generally to the level, even with the top of the dam crest and flat heading upstream, and then it'll stop aggrading or stop accumulating. And what Lane found was it does begin to act that way, and it does fill behind them, but it doesn't stop. It actually almost completely recovers to the old grade. And you can imagine that this wedge, it doesn't just stop at the arbitrary end of this figure. It can go miles and miles and miles and miles and miles upstream. And so we still don't, in our design of these structures, particularly irrigation diversions, we don't think this way, even though nowadays the sediment transport models that we have actually do predict in somewhat of a more coarse way, but they still predict this kind of an end result. And again, so like our, again, this is something we should expect when we construct a feature in a live stream. And it's something we still don't really wrap our heads around in terms of looking at the effects. So Lane and his compatriots basically took all of his studies and said that, well, energy and sediment are proportional to flow and slope. So if you change any of those things, flow, slope, sediment load, or whatever the last one was, particle size, the river's going to respond. And this balance, this formula allows you to predict what that response is going to be in a live river system. And so if you are designing, and so my own thought here is that actually it's not just water discharge, it's what's called effective geomorphic force, or flows generally at bank full or higher are going to drive this process. So if you're designing something and you're not incorporating the response of the riverine system to this new structure, you're only looking at the effect of the river on the new structure, then you're not designing sustainably. You need to design for the load that structure is going to take, and you need to design for the effects that that structure is going to have on the environment around it. And that's really the failure of things like the Corps' levee construction manual. Another fundamental is this concept of effective geomorphic force. And so basically, if you look at this dashed line here, B is a flow frequency. And so this would be about the 50% flow or the median flow during any given year. So this is a flow you might see late March, early April in a normal year. And again, maybe late June, early July, as the river receded at very short periods of time. In a normal year without floods, that's the duration. This is a dimensionless curve here, this A, which is basically because if you're dealing with the Columbia River, those flow values are going to be one thing. If you're dealing with Cowiche Creek, they're going to be entirely 3 orders of magnitude less than that. But if you integrate those energy curves, you come to the conclusion that most of the sediment transport here, the energy that's available, occurs during, a flood that occurs every 2 years or every 5 years, and you don't have to wait for a big giant 100-year flood to have an effect. So if you're designing sustainably, you're looking for things that are going to transpire not only at large flood discharges, like the FEMA standards drive you to, but at lower flood discharges, and how you can actually use those discharges to make things turn out the way you want. And finally, the other 2 things is this Michael Church paper, basically that says rivers are subject to thresholds of different types, so they function differently. There's a bunch of things that go on with them, but generally, at number 2, changes occur systematically along the drainage system as flow, gradient, and sediment character change. So there's a characteristic sequence of shapes and habitat types that can be described. And so if you should be thinking, or I do all the time, 24/7, where am I at in this watershed? What characteristics of channel shape, floodplain shape, and habitat types am I seeing here? And, are there kinds of things I would expect to see here? And if not, then you can kind of think about what caused those changes. So this is you need to know where you're at in the watershed and what should be occurring there. And you also need to know where you are in any alluvial valley. Because if you're in the top part of the valley, up around, say, in the Gap to Gap reach, the confluence of the Yakima and the Natchez River, things are different, way different up there than you would be at the lower end of the valley by Union Gap. You're going to have completely different plant communities, sediment supply, flow characteristics, channel and floodplain shapes are going to bend completely and become different. So where am I in this valley, and what kinds of structures, shapes, and habitats should I be seeing here? And am I seeing something different from what that is? So the design process for sustainability is just what I was talking about. You look at the current condition, and do I expect to see that at this position in the watershed, at this position in the valley? And if it's different, what processes, like changes in flow, or actions like construction of levees or bridges or irrigation diversions, have caused this change? Okay. And then your design goals are, can I restore conditions to what I expect to see at this position in the watershed and in the valley through actions or restoration of processes? And you can use Lane's balance and Lane's discussion in both that kind of diagnostic or trying to figure out what's going on phase, and in the design phase of, if I take this action, what do I expect to occur in terms of moving towards a more normal and sustainable condition, or maybe not so normative and so sustainable condition. And really, you don't need the numerical models or much at this stage to start to begin to think about, okay, what do I need to do? And especially to design what to think about. Are these conditions sustainable over time and into the future? And if they're not, you need to tell folks, I don't believe this is sustainable. I believe this levee is going to fail here. I believe these irrigation diversions are going to fail at these positions here for these reasons. And then when they do, people will start to listen to you and believe what you have to say. But in a sense, you've got to be diagnostic, and you've got to call out problems that you see on the landscape so that when they actually occur, folks will trust that you can find a resolution to make those things more sustainable over the long term, and you can hold their hands while you implement them. So as an example, this is the Ramblers Park area just upstream of that photo I showed you of the collapsed levee. And the area now next to the cars has failed a couple of times as well. And then this lower portion in the foreground was added after the 1996 flood, because the river was just going around the end of the levee and flowing through the wrecking yard and all those cars, transporting cars off site, all the pollutants, not a pretty scene. So because you had a levee there, and because it was getting flanked, the river was going around it, it was expanded. And so that's kind of what you see with these insustainably designed levees or other infrastructure features. So we did, for the second time, reconfigure our wrecking yard and then set back the flood control levee, and then created these, what we call pilot channels in the floodplain, just as an initial state of these are the kinds of things we would expect to see at this position in this valley and at this position in the watershed. And we're going to let the river really do the most of the ground and the earthworking and creation of the new shapes that it needs to have based on its own energy events, its own situation, moving forward into the future. So we're thinking along these lines of, at least hundreds of years in the future, in terms of, is this sustainable moving forward? And then some notes. I do not want to beat up on the modern mathematical models too much, but I do want to go back to Lane and his paper. So this is just an excerpt from the history of Colorado State University hydraulics. And so Lane is in this upper picture standing next to this physical model of Grand Coulee Dam and the powerhouse right next to it. And they're looking in this very large building. Well, how does that affect everything? And so if you understand Lane, then you understand that the mathematical models are trying to, approximate Lane and what they were finding through these physical models. So the balance of how you change things is really incorporated in Lane. It's very difficult to do it, and the numerical models, the modern ones, still can't do all the things that the thought process of Lane can do. The other thing is you got to take both of these with a grain of salt, in that neither physical or numerical models really deal with finer sediment very well. And so if you have systems with a lot of fine sediment coming out in the Yakima Basin, the Tieton has a massive amount of fine sediment coming out of the reservoir, a lot of it actually naturally created. And you can only go yay so far with the predictive powers of either the numerical models or kind of the thought process with the Lane's balance. But over the long term and at a coarse scale, the numerical models, especially the modern two-dimensional models that can do things across space, are very handy for looking at, okay, I believe this thing functions like this, and actually validating that or shooting what you think into holes. So they're incredibly handy for that. And they're also incredibly handy for big things. If you have the data to look back in time and model what, how much aggradation should have occurred or how much downcutting with these big coarse changes, They're very good at that in terms of validating, yes, these are the main reasons why you see these conditions in the watershed. So they have value. So this is a physical example. I don't have a good photo of the current progress here, but this is Nelson Dam on the Yakima River, on the Natchez River. And we're replacing this right now, basically rearranging it to improve sediment transport flow, to improve flood flow connections, conveyance capacity, and to the chronic, serious fish passage problems at this facility. So we did that with a physical model, looking at, okay, if we constructed this big ramp and move the diversion point upstream and change things around, how would that turn out? Would it be sustainable? Can we? And we did screwy things like threw artificial logs in there and saw, okay, where do those build up? And that caused changes in design to, okay, we'll need to figure out how to clean those out and do those kinds of things. So these physical models look not only at kind of calculations, but the whole system you're dealing with to the degree that the model scale can. Whereas the numerical models approximate it and look at parts of this. You could get a numerical model to do this, but it's not going to do the full range of things that either this physical model or thinking about things in Lane's context can do. So if you design for the sustainability, you get other benefits. It's really more efficient economically. There's less maintenance, there's less uncertainty, there's more surety about where things are going to be in the future. There's less risk of failure, there's less frequent repair, because you've basically designed with a series of knowns to the best of your abilities to handle the variability in the environment into the future. And there's less environmental damages. There's less emergencies, less chronic repeated repairs in the same spot over and over and over again, and less ecological damage and constantly, resetting the system and never allowing it to progress into something mature with mature habitat types and mature rivering processes happening there. And so, those are big benefits, less ability to calculate them, but real nonetheless. And politically, practically, societally, very big benefits. And then fundamental 3, if you're really going to spend the money and you really are going to think sustainably out into the future, then your designs should incorporate maximizing environmental benefits. Okay, so whether that's during an emergency or during a planned action. So, during the flood in 2012 at Ramblers Park and during the Gap to Gap in 2011 on the Yakima, failing levees, let's pull back those levees and try and set them back. We were successful in both cases, wildly successful in the Gap to Gap. The Nile landslide in 2009, there's a lot of hazard laying here. We plugged the river with this landslide material. What can we do in this response? Not only to deal with the landslide and the hazard, but to actually allow the river to take control of its kind of own shape and its own habitat types and be sustainable over time. For planned actions, we can open up side channels and take pressure off of irrigation diversions. We can, remove the wrecking yards. Whoops, that wasn't supposed to work. We can remove the wrecking yards, at Donald Wapato, reconfigure the one at Nelson, reconfigure the one on Nob Hill in the Gap to Gap reach, and actually get a lot of sustainability out of those. And then the measuring stick, or the measuring stick that I like to use for environmental benefit, is life histories. How many life histories of different plant and animal species can we fit into a floodplain restoration project or a project to make infrastructure safer? How can we manipulate that? And the opposite is also true. How can we address the presence of things like reed canary grass, cracked willow, yellow flag iris, smallmouth bass, invasive species, and actually de-emphasize habitats for those and colonization of those habitats by native species. So if you are truly thinking long-term, you really can get these long-term benefits out of it, not just you know, the short-term year one, but thinking 20, 30, 40, 50, a century ahead. So the benefits there are you get more resilient and diverse landscapes, increased ecosystem productivity for fish, if you want to fish, and wildlife and cultural resources, and more resilient and sustainable landscapes where disturbances are natural and beneficial events that just reinforce the stability even more. For salmon populations, you protect and expand habitats for life histories, you know, like rearing and spawning, and you allow lost life histories, you know, new spawning areas, new rearing periods and habitats to be re-expressed in these salmon populations. At the large scale benefits, you know, a floodplain restoration at the scale of our Gap to Gap project, where you're talking, you know, in the over 2,000 acres of restored floodplain access, you have large scale benefits downstream for many, many, many miles of hydrology, reduce flood risk, you improve the local climate, there's carbon sequestration, there's all those kinds of large scale benefits as well, which is again why BRIC has gone to, you know, allowing for this $27,000 per acre per year ecosystem services credit for floodplain restoration. And you get all the kind of the recreational and health benefits that go with those other three benefits. And then I'm going to finish with kind of Yakima Basin specific benefits. So if you actually look at the history of this valley, most of the irrigation infrastructure, the diversions were installed over a very short period of time, within like 15 years of each other. Some of the larger ones coming, you know, 10 or 15 years later, but still when natural processes dominated, before we had levee systems, before we had the ability to shove things around, before we had highways and railroads and all those kinds of things to a large extent. So when we restore balance to the river system, that is the riverine processes, those habitats, those shapes, we're really restoring the major economic system of the valley as well. And so the economy and ecology don't normally conflict in this basin in terms of floodplain restoration. We lessen the stress all the way around, and it really can benefit most folks. And then related to that, almost all of the infrastructure in the basin was constructed relative to the slope and grade of the river and its floodplain. So every irrigation drainage ditch, every sewer and water line, every major and minor road, all the railroads and other pieces of infrastructure function better when the floodplains and the channels are more or less in balance, and these natural processes are allowed to function, because that's how the system was laid out originally. And those restoration goals can meet all of these kind of benefits. And that's all I got today.
Thank you so much, Joel. That was so interesting. I always enjoy hearing your perspectives on these things. And again, thanks to Arden and Joel for joining us this evening to share their expertise. Apparently you did so well that we had no questions, but I'd like to unmute everybody or unmute yourselves. And if you have questions, you didn't want to put them in the chat, please do so. We're also going to launch a quick poll, which might happen here in a second. I don't have control over the poll, so we'll see how this goes. Somehow I became not the host, and here we are. Oh, I'm trying to see if something just happened. Do you all see a poll? I do not see a poll, but maybe someone else does. Well, technology may not be working for us tonight. Maybe it'll happen in a second. But does anyone have any questions for Joel or Arden this evening? Well, we all absolutely know everything about floodplains.
Are we unmuted? Are we unmuted?
Oh, yeah, go ahead. Thank you for unmuting yourself. I thought we were, let's see.
Yes, I just did.
Perfect. Go ahead.
This is Terry Keenan. I'm retired. I used to be the head of the Water Resources and probably the Flood Control Zone District for about 15 years while Joel was there. And I just want to thank Arden and Joel for the presentation. The role of the counties is very important in uniting, I think. Lots of diverse interests. And when I say diverse, it's not just the environmental, it is the transportation, the irrigators, all of those things are coming to the commissioners to get all kinds of decisions made. So having that voice in these two locations is really helpful, I think, for all parties. I would just say that I came and took this particular job, which I'm now retired from, because I saw so much potential in this particular basin. And I think we should know a little bit about the history of the levees. That won't go on very long at all. But the reason that the river is messed up is the most important thing. And that's the only way to undo it. We have too many roads and too many railways, but they're there. And they're necessary because we have an economy, and the economy is driven by water, which is the irrigation stuff. So we have these three levels of infrastructure, which are basically put in place and have been inherited by all of those that are listening to this presentation. The way that was all put together with the levees is kind of interesting. There was an act in 1911, 1912 that enabled the irrigation districts to get money to put levees in, which they did do. They created irrigation districts. So now we had extra levees, and then people started to live behind those. So now we have all the infrastructure, and then we have people moving in behind, which is a much more difficult thing to live with. And then also we have farms that are being protected. So it becomes a conflict as we go along. And I think we have to be very thankful to, I mean, I can give you the whole history of how it happened in this basin. We don't have time, but essentially at one point in 1936, the chief of the army proposed to Congress that we put about 100 miles of levees into this particular basin, and they would have been all up against the river bank. So it would have been a very different thing if that had gone forward. What it did generate is those ones that Arden showed, the first ones in 47 and the ones in Yakima County as well. And thankfully they weren't as continuous or as extensive. What we're doing, Joel is talking about, and Arden too, is trying to get rid of as much of those levees as we can, because we have to look at what really is needed.
Do me a favor.
Am I gone? Am I still there?
Yeah,
You're
still
fine.
there.
We had some background noise. I took care of it for you.
Yeah. So for those on the environmental side, we have a great debt, all of us, to the nation for resisting, and the Bureau then had to move forward to produce the Reaches report, and we got to really understand in one place the value of these reaches, and that whole turnaround basically has made the Yakima Basin a much different place than the rest of the Columbia River. And so I think I just want to shout out to the nation around that. I would say that another great use of the counties at this time is we're trying to pull back the levees. We're trying to get dams changed in design, like Nelson Dam, as you've seen. And but we're also situated next door to the roads department. So we walk over to the roads department and we go, when are you putting in another bridge? And where will it go? And so we're trying to stop or constricted bridges and have replacement bridges, because all of this infrastructure gets damaged. So I think we, including myself, have a great desire to see the floodplains opened up again and get people out of there. Not that they're not compensated, because it's not the best thing for our society. And as Joel has pointed out, we are spending a fortune to protect a lot of people. or few people, and that's not really the goal, and that's the direction that we're going. So I think I'll just end there and just say that it's been a pleasure to work on the basin and be involved with all the people that I have been involved with, and I wish you all lots of luck.
Thank you for your perspective and comments. Well, I think that Stephen has the poll results, so I'm going to let him share those.
Yeah, sure do. Looks like everybody responded, and the majority of people were on a floodplain sometime in the last week. 58%, 7 people. 4 people on the floodplain within this month, 1 this year, and 1 never. Whoever that is needs to go out on a floodplain.
Go on a floodplain.
Sometime. For which benefits floodplains provide are you most excited for? Habitat improvement was the most exciting, 10 out of 12. Second is open spaces restoration and ecosystem and climate resiliency.
Oh, excellent. Well, that was what we were hoping folks were going to get out of this. So, well, thanks for hanging in there for a little over time, but there's more of this coming soon. Our next presentation will be on February 1st, and that is on stage 0 restoration. So go to our website to sign up or let us know if you have any questions. And again, thank you to our presenters this evening, Joel Freudenthal and Arden Thomas. Exceptional job. So appreciated your time and talent and expertise and sharing all of that with us this evening. Thanks, Stephen, for hanging in there and helping me out with all of our technical issues. And for our staff that joined this evening, including Becca, wanted to say thanks for hanging out with us tonight. Okay.
Great, and Stephen, that was well facilitated, and Arden and Joel, that was just exactly perfect. Thank you so much.
Thank you for having us.
Yeah.
Yep.
Absolutely. Everybody have a great night. Thank you.
Mhm.
Bye.
Bye.